Unaware of her $350 million inheritance, Binta's real-life friend was abandoned by her billionaire husband and even her own children. They told her, "You're too simple. We want a new mom." But what that new, younger woman later did to them will break your heart and open your eyes. This is a true story of Binta's friend, so please watch till the very end, because if you leave early, you'll spoil my hard work, and I'll feel like all the emotion I poured into this story was for nothing. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. Every moment of this journey has been written with your love. You've laughed with me, cried with me, and stood beside me like a true family. You're not just viewers. You are the soul behind every word I write, the light that keeps my stories alive. Today, I pray from the deepest part of my heart. May the Almighty bless every woman with timeless strength, beauty that shines from within, and peace that no storm can steal. May every man walk with wisdom, kindness, and faith. May your homes be filled with laughter, love, and unshakable unity. May your hearts never break, your dreams never fade, and may every sunrise bring you hope, healing, and divine favor. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, "I am with Mr. Peter." Some women are born into cages. Others build them with their own hands, brick by loving brick, never realizing they are constructing their own prisons until the door locks from the outside and the key is thrown away by the very people they sacrificed everything to protect. Tasmin King woke in darkness, as she had done every morning for more years than her exhausted mind cared to count. The clock beside her bed remained face down because she had learned long ago that knowing the exact hour of her rising only made the weight of it heavier. Before dawn broke over the city, before light crept through the expensive curtains of the mansion she maintained but did not own, before her family stirred in their comfortable beds built on foundations they would never acknowledge, she was already awake, already working, already erasing herself so they could exist in comfort they believed they had earned through their own merit. Her feet touched cold marble floors and she moved through the vast emptiness of the King mansion like a ghost haunting her own life. The kitchen became her sanctuary in these silent hours, the only place where her hands created something that would be consumed and her labor would be noticed, even if never appreciated. She prepared breakfast with the precision of someone who understood that even the smallest mistake would be weaponized against her. Fruit cut into perfect segments, because anything less would prompt comments about her declining attention to detail. Coffee brewed to exact specifications, because Brandon King did not tolerate variations in his routine. Egg seasoned precisely because her husband had long ago stopped tasting her love in the food and now only noticed when something failed to meet his exacting standards. The dining table was set before the sun rose. Cloth napkins folded into elegant shapes she had taught herself from videos, watched on a phone screen at 2 a.m. when sleep refused to come and grief needed somewhere to hide. Everything gleamed, everything perfect, everything ready for a family that would walk past her efforts as if they materialized through magic rather than through the breaking of one woman's spirit hour by hour. Day by day, year by year, Brandon descended the grand staircase without looking at his wife, his eyes fixed on the phone in his hand, scrolling through messages and emails that were infinitely more important than the woman who had spent 2 hours ensuring his morning began in comfort. He sat at the head of the table as if it were his throne, and perhaps it was, built on the bones of her dreams and the ashes of her ambitions. He ate the food she prepared without tasting it, without acknowledging the hands that created it. And when he finally spoke, his first words of the day were complaints wrapped in contempt. "This coffee is too hot. You should know by now to let it cool before serving. Do I have to teach you everything?" Tasmin said nothing. She had learned years ago that explanations were viewed as excuses, that defending herself only provided more ammunition for attacks, that silence was the only response that did not escalate into something darker. She simply rose from her chair, took his cup, and replaced it with one that had been cooling for precisely the amount of time his preference demanded. He did not thank her. He never thanked her. Gratitude had died in their marriage so long ago that she could barely remember what it felt like to be appreciated rather than tolerated. Luna appeared next, their daughter, and the sight of her made something ache in Tasmin's chest that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with the particular agony of watching your child become a stranger who looks at you with contempt. The girl scrolled through her phone without glancing up, her young face already arranged into the expression of perpetual disappointment that seemed to be her default setting whenever her mother existed in her presence. Why did you pack me a lunch like I'm some kind of child? Just give me money to eat out like normal parents do. God, you're so embarrassing. The words landed like small cuts, the kind that do not bleed immediately, but accumulate over time until you look down one day and realize you are covered in wounds that never quite heal. Tasmin wanted to remind her daughter that she had once cried if her mother was even 5 minutes late picking her up from school, that she had refused to sleep without 3 stories and 2 songs, that she had clung to her mother's legs at parties and declared that Mommy was the best person in the whole world. But that little girl was gone, replaced by this young woman who had learned from her father that love was conditional and that mothers existed to be criticized rather than cherished. Harry came last, grabbing food without sitting, without speaking, without acknowledging that his mother had risen before dawn to prepare the meal he was consuming with such casual indifference. He disappeared back upstairs to eat alone in his room, and Tasmin sat at the table she had set for 5, eating scraps while her family scattered to their separate worlds, none of them pausing to wonder who held the center when everyone else pulled away. The morning routine complete, Tasmin began the second shift of her invisible labor. Laundry sorted and started, bathrooms cleaned until they sparkled, beds made with hospital corners because anything less invited criticism. She answered emails for Brandon's company, managing schedules and correspondence that he took credit for, while she remained unnamed and unacknowledged. She organized the twins' school schedules, ensuring nothing was forgotten, no deadline missed, no opportunity lost, knowing that if anything fell through the cracks, it would be her failure rather than their responsibility. Her mind drifted as her hands worked, traveling backward through time to the woman she used to be before she became this shadow, moving through other people's lives. She had been brilliant once, top of her class at Howard University, her mind sharp as broken glass, her future so bright that professors fought over who would mentor her toward inevitable greatness. 3 prestigious firms had competed for her attention, offering 6-figure starting salaries that seemed like impossible wealth to a girl who had grown up watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep food on the table. She had been so close to everything she had worked for, one signature away from a life built on her own merit rather than reflected glory. Then Brandon King walked into her life with his failing startup and his magnetic confidence and his promises of partnership. He had dreams that seemed bigger than any corporate job, visions of empire that made traditional success look small and boring by comparison. He courted her with intensity that felt like love, swearing they would build something extraordinary together, that her brilliant mind, combined with his ambition, would create wealth and success beyond imagination. She believed him. God help her, she believed every word. She graduated with highest honors and turned down every job offer to pour her genius into his collapsing company. She worked 18-hour days fixing his disastrous financial records, creating projections that actually made sense, pitching to investors with numbers that proved the business could survive. When the twins were born, she stepped back from visible company work but never stopped being its foundation. Analyzing markets during nap times, managing supplier relationships while nursing infants. Her brilliance hidden behind domestic labor because Brandon insisted investors would respect him more if they believed he built everything. Alone, the memory that haunted her most persistently came from 18 years ago, when the twins were small and the company was dying, and Brandon came home night after night, drunk with failure and rage. She could still see him punching walls, screaming that everything he had built was collapsing, that he was going to lose it all and be exposed as the fraud he secretly feared himself to be. She had not cried. She had not panicked. She had gone to work with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that desperate times demanded desperate solutions. She did not sell jewelry as other wives might have done, because jewelry brought thousands when she needed millions. She used her mind instead, the weapon she had been convinced to hide away. She called every investor who had fled and convinced them to return with projections so detailed they could not refuse. She took over the company accounts herself, finding waste and inefficiency Brandon's arrogance had blinded him to. She even traveled hours by bus to meet suppliers he had insulted, rebuilding relationships his ego had destroyed. But her greatest sacrifice remained hidden in legal documents that only one other person would ever see. Her mother had died not long before, leaving her a house that represented the only inheritance she would ever receive. Tasmin sold that house, every brick and memory, converting her mother's legacy into $350 million. She funneled every cent into Brandon's dying company through an anonymous trust with explicit instructions that he never learn the investor's identity. She told him a mysterious benefactor believed in his vision, and he accepted the lie because his ego could not imagine otherwise. The company survived because of her money, then thrived, then exploded into an empire worth billions. Brandon's face appeared on magazine covers as the visionary who built success from nothing. His story was told as inspiration about one man's determination and genius. Tasmin never corrected the narrative. She believed that good wives built their husbands up, that her reward would come in the form of gratitude and deepening love and a family that appreciated the foundation she had laid beneath their feet. She had been so catastrophically wrong. The afternoon bled into evening, and Tasmin stood in the kitchen of the mansion her money had saved, preparing dinner for a family that would barely acknowledge her existence. Her hands moved through familiar motions while her mind circled the same painful truth over and over. She had given them everything, and they had given her nothing in return except the privilege of continuing to serve them. She had sacrificed her future for theirs, and they repaid her with contempt disguised as normalcy. The front door opened, and Brandon's voice filled the house, but it was not speaking to her. It never was anymore. Chapter 2. The Woman with the Perfect Smile. The years had been kind to Brandon King in ways that prosperity often is to men who mistake luck for genius and sacrifice for weakness. His company had grown into something monstrous and magnificent, its success built on foundations he had long ago convinced himself he had laid alone. Wealth had made him harder rather than softer, more certain of his own brilliance, more dismissive of anyone who could not keep pace with his accelerating ambitions. He had become the kind of man who measured his worth by the fear he inspired in subordinates and the envy he provoked in peers, never pausing to wonder what internal rot the external shine concealed. Tasmin noticed the shift in him long before the woman arrived to make that shift explicit and undeniable. Brandon began making comments about her appearance with the casual cruelty of someone who no longer felt obligated to pretend affection. He suggested she needed to lose weight when she had never been anything but slender. He commented that she should dress better when she wore the clothes he claimed to prefer. He compared her unfavorably to wives of his business associates, women who had personal trainers and cosmetic procedures and stylists on permanent retainer, as if aging naturally was a moral failing rather than biological inevitability. Luna and Harry absorbed their father's contempt like sponges absorbing poison. their childhood love for their mother curdling into teenage disdain that felt personal and deliberate. They began calling her old-fashioned when she tried to guide them toward decent choices. They mocked her simple tastes and quiet preferences, treating her wisdom as ignorance and her sacrifices as embarrassing reminders of a past they wanted to forget. Tasmin watched her children transform into strangers who looked at her with something dangerously close to shame, and she wondered when exactly love had become contingent on maintaining their approval rather than deserving their respect. The woman, who would finish destroying what remained of Tasmin's marriage, walked through the mansion door on an evening that felt like every other evening, until it suddenly was not. Her name was Ivory Sullivan, and she carried herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had learned early that beauty combined with calculated charm could open doors that merit alone would never unlock. She was young enough to make Tasmin feel ancient, polished enough to make her feel unrefined, ambitious enough to recognize vulnerability when she saw it and exploit it without hesitation or remorse. Brandon asked me to drop these contracts off for his review this weekend. I hope I'm not interrupting family time. The words were correct, but the tone was wrong, carrying undertones that suggested she knew exactly what she was interrupting and felt no guilt about the intrusion. Ivory's eyes swept across the mansion's interior with the assessing gaze of someone already measuring spaces for future occupation. Her hand rested on Brandon's arm with casual familiarity that spoke of boundaries already crossed and lines already blurred. When she bothered to acknowledge Tasmin at all, it was with a smile that held no warmth, just the cold triumph of someone who had identified her target and begun the campaign to claim territory she had decided belonged to her. Brandon transformed in Ivory's presence in ways that made the contrast with his treatment of Tasmin almost unbearably painful. He laughed at her comments with genuine amusement rather than the grudging tolerance he offered his wife. His posture relaxed and his voice softened, and his entire demeanor shifted into something almost youthful. He looked at Ivory with attention he had not directed at Tasmin in so many years that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by the man she had sacrificed everything to save. The weeks that followed revealed the pattern with depressing predictability. Ivory began appearing at the mansion with increasing frequency, always with professional excuses that grew thinner and less convincing over time. She stayed for dinners that stretched long into evening, dominating conversations with talk of business strategies and market opportunities that deliberately excluded Tasmin from participation. She laughed at Brandon's jokes with enthusiasm that suggested everything he said was brilliance, rather than the recycled observations Tasmin had heard 1,000 times before. She touched him constantly, small gestures that built intimacy through accumulation. Her hand on his arm when making a point, her shoulder brushing his when reviewing documents. Her presence invading his personal space with the confidence of someone who knew her advances would be welcomed rather than rejected. Luna and Harry fell under Ivory's spell with the ease of young people who mistake polish for substance and sophistication for character. They saw in her everything their father had taught them to value: glamour and ambition and connection to social circles they desperately wanted to penetrate. Ivory flattered them with practiced skill, bringing Luna expensive cosmetics and designer clothes, teaching her how to present herself for male attention rather than personal satisfaction. She took Harry to exclusive venues and introduced him to children of wealthy families, expanding his network while subtly suggesting his mother's protective instincts were holding him back from experiences he deserved. The twins began comparing their mother to Ivory with cutting directness that suggested they no longer felt obligated to protect her feelings or spare her pain. Luna asked why Tasmin did not dress better, did not get her hair and nails done professionally, did not make more effort to look like she belonged in the life Brandon's success had created. Harry questioned why his mother seemed so disconnected from modern culture, so content with her small world when other mothers were dynamic and engaged and interesting. They treated her increasing invisibility as a personal failing rather than a deliberate erasure, never pausing to wonder who had taught them that a woman's worth decreased with her visibility. Tasmin found evidence of Brandon's betrayal scattered throughout the house, like breadcrumbs leading to inevitable heartbreak, restaurant receipts from places she had never visited, hotel charges on credit cards she no longer had access to, perfume scents clinging to his clothes that matched nothing in her bathroom. She did not confront him because she already knew the truth, and hearing him lie would only make the betrayal more explicit and harder to survive. She simply continued her routines, waking before dawn and working past midnight, maintaining the illusion of family while watching that family actively replace her with a younger model they believed better represented their current status. The night that crystallized everything came without warning or fanfare, just another evening in an endless series of evenings where Tasmin performed invisible labor for people who had stopped seeing her as human. She brought coffee to Brandon's study late at night, a gesture of care she continued making despite knowing it would not be acknowledged or appreciated. She knocked softly before entering, giving him time to compose himself if needed, then pushed open the door to find the scene that would replay in her nightmares for years to come. Ivory sat perched on the edge of Brandon's massive desk, her body angled toward him in postures that suggested intimacy had already progressed far beyond professional boundaries. Her hand rested on his shoulder with possessive familiarity, his attention focused on her with intensity he had not directed at his wife in decades. They were laughing together, sharing some private joke that created a bubble of connection Tasmin could not penetrate, even if she wanted to try. They barely acknowledged her entrance. Brandon waved his hand dismissively without looking up, his voice carrying the irritated tone of someone whose privacy had been interrupted by insignificant intrusion. "Just leave it on the table. I'm busy with important work." Tasmin set the coffee down with hands that had started trembling without her permission. She turned to leave, desperate to escape, before they saw how completely the moment had shattered something essential inside her. But Ivory's voice stopped her at the door, words delivered with casual cruelty that suggested she knew exactly what damage they would inflict. "You're so lucky to have such dedicated household staff, Brandon. It's so hard to find people willing to work these kinds of hours anymore." Brandon did not correct her, did not defend his wife, did not acknowledge that the woman Ivory had just dismissed as staff was the reason he had a house and a company and a life worth envying. He simply nodded in agreement and returned his attention to the woman who was replacing his wife in every way that mattered, leaving Tasmin standing in the doorway of his study, invisible in her own home, erased from her own marriage, reduced to servant status by the people she had sacrificed everything to elevate. She closed the door with careful quietness and stood in the hallway for a long time, her hand pressed against her chest where pain had taken up permanent residence, trying to remember how to breathe around the certainty that was slowly crushing her. Her marriage was over. Her family had already replaced her. She was living in a house built on her money with people who viewed her as an inconvenient reminder of a past they wanted to forget. The only question remaining was how long she would tolerate her own erasure before she found the courage to walk away from everything she had built and everyone she had loved, and the life that was slowly killing her one invisible moment at a time. Chapter 3. The birthday that shattered everything. Tasmin began preparing for the twins' birthday 3 days before the actual date, pouring every remaining drop of hope and love and desperate need into creating a celebration that might remind her children who she was and what she had given them. She woke even earlier than usual, working through darkness that felt heavier than normal, decorating the mansion with balloons and streamers in purple and silver because those were Luna's favorite colors, and had been since she was small enough to believe. Her mother knew everything worth knowing about beauty and joy. The decorations took an entire day to arrange properly, Tasmin climbing ladders and stretching across furniture to ensure every corner of the house reflected celebration rather than the slow death their family had been experiencing. She refused help from the remaining staff because she needed every detail to carry her fingerprints, needed her children to see that their mother had touched every surface with hands that still remembered how to create beauty even after years of being told she had nothing valuable left to offer. The second day was dedicated to baking Luna's favorite cake, a red velvet recipe passed down from Tasmin's grandmother that required patience and precision and love measured in hours rather than cups. She mixed batter by hand because the recipe demanded it, her arms aching with the repetitive motion, but her heart insisting that shortcuts would diminish the magic. The cream cheese frosting took 3 attempts to achieve the exact consistency Luna had once declared the best thing she ever tasted, back when her mother's cooking was treasure rather than obligation. The third day, she prepared Harry's favorite meal, the jerk chicken and rice and peas that connected him to heritage he had started pretending did not matter. She stood over the stove for hours, adjusting heat and timing and seasoning until the flavors sang the way her son used to sing when he was small and believed his mother's kitchen produced miracles. She also spent hours editing together a video montage of the twins' childhood, sorting through thousands of photos and clips, selecting moments that captured their joy and innocence and the uncomplicated love they used to feel for the woman who gave them life. When the birthday finally arrived, Tasmin moved through the mansion, making final adjustments with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and anxiety and hope that felt dangerous in its persistence. She had invited extended family members she had not seen in months, old friends who remembered when the King family was happy, people who had watched Luna and Harry grow from babies into young adults. She needed witnesses to this celebration, needed people who might remind her children that family was supposed to mean something beyond convenience and conditional affection. Guests began arriving in the late afternoon, filling the mansion with conversation and laughter that felt almost foreign after months of cold silence. Tasmin welcomed each person with warmth that cost her more than they could possibly understand, playing the role of gracious hostess while her heart hammered against her ribs with dread she could not quite name. Luna and Harry accepted birthday wishes with polite smiles that never reached their eyes, and their attention constantly drifting toward the entrance as if waiting for someone more important than family to arrive. Brandon appeared several hours after the party started, walking through the door with the casual lateness of someone who knew the celebration could not truly begin without his presence. But he did not arrive alone. Ivory Sullivan entered on his arm, wearing a dress that cost more than Tasmin had spent on the entire party, her hair and makeup perfect, her smile bright and proprietary as she surveyed the room, like a queen inspecting territory she had already claimed. The atmosphere shifted immediately, tension crackling through the space as guests registered what Brandon's choice to bring Ivory meant. Family members exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Old friends looked at Tasmin with expressions mixing sympathy and outrage. But Luna and Harry reacted with pure delight, rushing across the room to greet Ivory with enthusiasm they had not shown any other guest, hugging her and complimenting her appearance, and pulling her into the center of the party as if she were the person being celebrated rather than them. Tasmin felt something crack inside her chest, a fracture so deep it made breathing painful, watching her children embrace the woman who was actively replacing their mother. She forced herself to keep moving, serving food to guests who thanked her with pity in their eyes, cutting the cake she had spent hours perfecting, while Luna posed for photos with Ivory instead of her, playing the video montage to a room that paid more attention to phones than memories of childhood innocence. Her sister found her in the kitchen during a quiet moment, pulling her aside with fierce protectiveness in her grip. "You don't have to tolerate this disrespect. This is your house, your party, your children. Tell that woman to leave." But Tasmin shook her head, exhaustion and defeat making her voice flat and emotionless. "It stopped being my house a long time ago. I'm just the woman who cleans it." As evening deepened and the party reached what should have been its celebratory peak, Brandon called for everyone's attention, his voice cutting through conversations with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He stood at the center of the living room with Ivory beside him, Luna and Harry flanking them like a complete family unit that Tasmin was not part of. The arrangement was deliberate and cruel, a visual representation of her erasure made explicit for everyone to witness. Brandon began speaking about how proud he was of the twins, how they had grown into remarkable young adults, ready to take on the world, how their future was bright because they had learned what it meant to be successful and ambitious. He thanked various people for attending, expressed gratitude for his beautiful home and thriving company, talked about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who elevated you toward greatness. He never once mentioned Tasmin, never acknowledged the woman who spent 3 days preparing this celebration, who gave birth to the children being celebrated, who sacrificed everything so he could stand there pretending he built his empire alone. Guests shifted uncomfortably, family members' expressions darkening with barely contained fury. But no one interrupted, because confronting Brandon King in his own house felt like a battle nobody was equipped to fight. Then Brandon's tone shifted, becoming more serious, and Tasmin's heart stopped completely because she knew what was coming, even before the words formed. "I have an important announcement to share with family tonight. Something I've been thinking about for quite some time. A decision that represents a new chapter in my life." He took Ivory's hand, raising it high enough for everyone to see, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of intimacy that left no room for misinterpretation. "I've realized over the past year that life is too short to settle for less than what you deserve. I've found someone who understands my vision, who shares my ambition, who can stand beside me as an equal partner. I want to pursue a relationship with a woman who appreciates me properly and can match my success." The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs, family members starting to protest, old friends rising from their seats with outrage written across their faces. But before anyone could truly object, before the collective horror could organize itself into action, Luna stepped forward, her voice clear and cutting through the noise like a blade through flesh. "Harry and I have discussed this extensively with Father. We support his decision to find happiness. We think he deserves to be with someone who appreciates him properly." Harry nodded in agreement, his voice joining his sister's in a harmony of casual cruelty that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. "We're adults now. We understand that people grow apart, that marriages run their course. Father has worked too hard to be stuck in a relationship that no longer serves him." Then Luna turned to look directly at her mother, and what she said next would echo in Tasmin's mind forever. Words that could never be unsaid or forgiven. Cruelty so pure it transcended normal human capacity for causing pain. "You're too old now, Mother. We want someone younger for our father, someone who can keep up with him and represent our family properly. Father deserves a younger bride, someone who fits the life we have now, not the life we used to have." The room went completely silent, every guest frozen in absolute horror at what they had just witnessed. Family members stood with mouths open in shock, unable to process that a daughter had just told her mother she was being replaced like an outdated appliance in front of dozens of witnesses. The silence stretched and stretched until it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing, waiting to see how a woman responds when her own child participates in her public execution. Tasmin stood completely still, her body refusing to process the enormity of what was happening, her mind fracturing under weight of betrayal so profound it felt like dying while still breathing. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not beg or plead or fight, because something inside her had finally completely broken. the last thread of hope snapping with an almost audible sound that only she could hear. She looked at Brandon and saw a stranger where her husband used to be. She looked at Luna and Harry and saw reflections of their father's cruelty, young adults who had absorbed his lessons about disposability and learned that people were valuable only as long as they served your purposes. She looked at Ivory and saw triumph in her eyes. A woman who had won without ever having to fight because the family she was infiltrating had already decided to throw their mother away. The room waited for her to react. Guests holding their collective breath, family members poised to intervene if she collapsed or exploded or broke down in the spectacular way betrayed women are expected to break down. But Tasmin did none of these things. Instead, she simply nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that said she had heard them, understood them, accepted the truth they had spoken. Then she smiled, faint and heartbreaking, a smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile that looked like goodbye to anyone paying attention. She removed the apron she was still wearing from serving cake, folding it with careful precision, placing it on the nearest table with the gentle finality of someone setting down a burden they will never pick up again. She walked through the silent crowd, her head held high despite everything, her steps measured and deliberate, moving toward the grand staircase, while dozens of witnesses watched her ascend toward an ending they all understood was coming, but felt powerless to prevent. Not a single person tried to stop her. Not her sister, not her family, not the friends who came to celebrate, but stayed to witness destruction. They simply watched as Tasmin climbed the stairs slowly, disappeared into the bedroom where she had slept alone for months, and closed the door behind her with the quiet click of a lock sliding into place. Inside that room, she pulled a suitcase from the closet, the same suitcase she had packed for their honeymoon when she believed in forever. She packed quickly and efficiently, taking only what she needed, leaving behind jewelry Brandon bought her over the years, expensive clothes he insisted she wear to his events, material possessions that were supposed to compensate for love that slowly disappeared. She took her mother's photo album, her grandmother's recipe box, letters Luna and Harry wrote when they were children, and still believed their mother hung the moon. She changed into simple jeans and a sweater, comfortable clothes that made no statement except that she was done performing for people who refused to see her. She wrote 2 letters, one for the twins and one for Brandon, short notes saying only what needed to be said, that she hoped they found what they were looking for, that she would not be available to clean up the mess when they realized what they had done, that they should not try to find her because she was done being found by people who only needed her when convenient. Downstairs, the party had devolved into chaos, family members confronting Brandon and the twins, guests leaving in disgust. Ivory, standing in the center of it all, looking less triumphant now that she saw the social consequences of destroying a family so publicly. But Tasmin heard none of this, cared about none of this, because she was already gone in every way that mattered. She walked down the back staircase that staff used, the staircase she had used for years while carrying laundry and cleaning supplies, moving through her house like a servant one final time. She exited through the kitchen door, walked to her old modest car, and tossed her suitcase into the trunk with a thud that sounded like finality. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking at the mansion that represented her life's work, seeing lights blazing in every window, hearing muffled sounds of angry voices and slamming doors. Then she started the engine, backed out of the driveway slowly and carefully the way she did everything, and drove away from the King mansion, while inside the party continued without her. Music still playing from speakers she set up, cake still sitting on a table she decorated. The celebration of her children's birthday becoming the night their mother finally chose herself over people who would never choose her back. Chapter 4. The kingdom crumbles. Without its queen, days bled into weeks, and weeks collapsed into months. time moving forward with the indifferent cruelty it always shows to people experiencing catastrophe in slow motion. Inside the King Mansion, the new order established itself with the brutal efficiency of hostile takeovers and palace coups. Avery Sullivan moved into the master bedroom before Tasmin's absence had even registered fully, unpacking her expensive clothes into closets, still carrying the faint scent of the woman she had replaced, erasing every trace of the previous occupant with the thoroughness of someone who understood that claiming territory required eliminating all evidence of prior ownership. She assumed control of the household with confidence that bordered on arrogance, certain that maintaining a home required nothing more than issuing orders and expecting obedience. Within the first week, she fired the long-time staff who had worked for the King family for years, calling them outdated and inefficient, replacing them with younger people who did not know the family's routines or preferences or needs. She discarded Tasmin's carefully organized systems, her recipes, her schedules, declaring everything obsolete and unnecessary, never pausing to wonder why the house had run like a well-oiled machine under the previous woman's invisible management. The mansion began falling apart almost immediately, chaos creeping into spaces that had previously operated with seamless precision. Meals became disasters because the new cook did not know that Brandon hated onions, or that Luna was allergic to shellfish, or that Harry needed his food seasoned in specific ways. Laundry piled up in forgotten corners because nobody understood the complex rotation Tasmin had maintained. Appointments were missed because the new assistant did not know which commitments were actually important versus which could be rescheduled. The house that had once felt like a showcase of success began resembling an expensive hotel where nobody quite knew how anything worked. But the real transformation came in how Ivory treated Luna and Harry. A shift so dramatic and vicious it left both twins reeling with shock they were completely unprepared to handle. The woman, who had been charming and flattering when positioning herself as their father's replacement, revealed her true nature once her position was secure. She looked at the twins with contempt that made her previous kindness seem like the calculated performance it had always been. "You're going to help with housework from now on. All of it. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, everything your mother used to do that you took for granted." Luna stared at her in disbelief, certain this must be some kind of joke. "We don't do housework. We have staff for that. We're not servants." Ivory's smile was cold and sharp as broken glass, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who had been waiting to unleash punishment they had been planning for quite some time. "You used to be rich. Now you'll learn to work. Your mother spoiled you into uselessness, but I'm going to teach you what real labor feels like. Start with the kitchen. Those dishes won't wash themselves." Harry tried appealing to his father, certain that Brandon would intervene and restore the natural order where children of wealthy families did not perform manual labor. But Brandon barely looked up from his phone, his voice carrying the distracted indifference of someone who had already moved on to more important concerns. "Ivory's right. You've been spoiled long enough. Time you learned some discipline and work ethic. Do what she tells you." The twins found themselves thrust into a world they had never imagined they would have to navigate. Luna, who had never washed a dish in her life, stood at the kitchen sink with hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing plates and glasses and pots with growing horror at how endless the task seemed. Harry, who had never operated a vacuum cleaner or understood how laundry machines worked, found himself cleaning bathrooms and sorting clothes and performing labor that left his back aching and his hands raw. Avery watched their struggles with satisfaction that suggested this humiliation was the point rather than any actual need for their labor. She criticized everything they did, finding fault with every cleaned surface and every folded towel, making them repeat tasks until they met standards that seemed deliberately impossible to achieve. She worked them from early morning until late at night, giving them endless lists of chores that magically expanded the moment one task was completed. Your mother did this every single day for years, and she never complained once. But you can't even manage a few simple tasks without whining like children. Pathetic. The servants who had been hired to replace Tasmin's longtime staff began leaving one by one, unable to tolerate working under Ivory's management. She was cruel to everyone, treating employees like disposable resources, screaming at them for minor mistakes, creating an atmosphere of fear and resentment that made the mansion feel like a prison rather than a home. Within 2 months, all the new staff had quit, leaving only the 4 of them in that massive house, Brandon and Ivory, and 2 broken young adults, learning what their mother's invisible labor had actually entailed. Then came the incident that would haunt Luna and Harry with guilt that felt like physical weight pressing down on their chests. Ivory wore an expensive necklace to a charity dinner, a piece of jewelry that cost more than most people earned in a year. Diamonds and precious metals arranged in patterns that screamed wealth and status. When she returned home, she claimed the necklace was missing from her jewelry box, and her eyes landed on the twins with accusation that was already hardened into certainty before any investigation occurred. "One of you stole my necklace. I know it was you. You're jealous that I have nice things and you're reduced to servants, so you took something that doesn't belong to you. Thieves. Both of you are thieves." Luna and Harry protested desperately, swearing they had not touched her jewelry, had not even been in her room, would never steal from anyone, regardless of how they were being treated. But Ivory was relentless, her voice rising to a shriek that brought Brandon running from his study. "Your children are criminals. They stole my necklace and now they're lying about it. Are you going to let them get away with this? Are you going to teach them there are no consequences for theft?" Brandon looked at his children with an expression they had never seen before. Fury mixed with disappointment, mixed with something that looked dangerously close to hatred. He did not ask for their side of the story, did not consider that Ivory might be lying, did not remember that these were the same children he had once claimed to love more than anything in the world. He simply advanced on them with violence in his eyes and raised his hand and struck Luna across the face hard enough to leave a mark that would last for days. Harry tried to intervene and received the same treatment, his father's fist connecting with his jaw with force that sent him stumbling backward into furniture. Brandon beat both of them, while Ivory watched with satisfaction that revealed this had been the plan all along, humiliating them and turning their father against them in ways that emotional cruelty alone could not achieve. "You will learn respect. You will learn honesty. You will learn that theft has consequences in this family." The next day, Ivory found her necklace exactly where she had hidden it, tucked away in the back of her own drawer where she had placed it before making her accusations. She offered no apology, made no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, simply shrugged when Luna pointed out the necklace's miraculous reappearance. "I must have forgotten where I put it. These things happen." Luna and Harry looked at each other with dawning horror, understanding that the woman their father had chosen to replace their mother was not just cruel, but actively malicious, someone who would hurt them for entertainment and face no consequences because Brandon had already chosen sides and they were not on his. They began remembering their mother differently, seeing her invisible labor clearly now that it was absent, understanding what strength it had required to maintain that household while being treated with the casual contempt they had participated in and amplified. But pride and shame prevented them from admitting their mistake out loud, from acknowledging that they had thrown away the best person in their lives to make room for someone who treated them like garbage she was obligated to tolerate. They simply endured, washing dishes and scrubbing floors and learning what their mother had known all along, that labor without acknowledgement breaks something in your soul that is difficult to repair once it fractures. While the household descended into chaos and cruelty, Brandon's empire began showing cracks that would soon become catastrophic fissures. Deals that had been progressing smoothly suddenly fell apart for reasons he could not quite understand. Investors who had been loyal for years started pulling their support, citing concerns about company direction that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Suppliers who had provided materials and services reliably began demanding immediate payment, refusing credit terms that had been standard for years. Brandon could not understand why everything was collapsing, unaware that Tasmin had been the one maintaining these relationships all along. She had sent thank-you notes and remembered birthdays and hosted dinners that built trust and loyalty. Through personal connection rather than just contractual obligation, she had managed supplier relationships with grace that smoothed over Brandon's arrogance and maintained goodwill even when he gave none. She had been the invisible foundation holding everything together, and now that foundation had been removed, and the entire structure was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The company that had thrived and grown and become an empire worth billions started hemorrhaging money at alarming rates. Stock prices fell. Credit lines were cut. Major clients moved their business to competitors without explanation. Brandon worked longer hours trying to stem the bleeding, but everything he touched seemed to worsen rather than improve, as if the universe itself had decided his success was no longer permitted now that the woman who had actually created it was gone. Then came the revelation that would shatter what remained of his world into pieces too small to ever reassemble. The anonymous investor trust that had saved his company all those years ago, the mysterious benefactor he believed had recognized his genius and wanted to participate in his inevitable success, suddenly withdrew all remaining support. The investment firm managing the trust sent a formal letter stating that the benefactor had chosen to redirect resources elsewhere and would no longer be providing financial backing of any kind. Brandon tried desperately to contact them, to understand what had changed, to convince them to reconsider. But the firm refused to disclose the investor's identity, citing confidentiality agreements that had been ironclad from the beginning. All they would say was that the benefactor had fulfilled their obligations and now chose to end the relationship permanently and completely. Without that foundational support, the company's debt became impossible to manage. Creditors who had been patient suddenly demanded immediate payment. The empire that Brandon had built on foundations he never acknowledged began crumbling at accelerating speed, and he stood in the center of the destruction with no understanding of how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong so quickly, never pausing to consider that removing the actual architect of his success might have consequences. He was completely unprepared to survive. Chapter 5. The Truth That Destroyed Everything. The old manager walked into Brandon's office on an afternoon that felt like every other afternoon until it suddenly became the moment that divided his life into before and after. Gerald Hayes had worked for the King Company since the beginning, back when it was just Brandon and Tasmin and dreams that seemed impossible. He had watched the company nearly die and then miraculously resurrect. He had witnessed the growth and success and transformation into an empire. And he had carried a secret for 18 years that was about to destroy everything Brandon believed about himself and his achievements. Gerald's eyes were red and swollen, tears leaving tracks down his weathered face. He carried a folder filled with documents that looked official and legal and impossibly old. Papers that had been stored away in secure locations, with instructions. They never be revealed unless specific conditions were met. Those conditions had finally been triggered by the dissolution of the anonymous trust, and Gerald found himself obligated to reveal truth he had hoped would remain buried forever. Brandon looked up from the financial disaster spread across his desk. his face haggard from weeks of sleepless nights and failed attempts to save his collapsing empire. He barely registered Gerald's emotional state, too consumed with his own crisis to notice anyone else's pain. "Whatever it is, it better be important. I don't have time for drama right now." Gerald's voice shook when he finally forced words past the grief clogging his throat. 18 years ago, when your company was collapsing, when every investor had pulled out and suppliers were demanding payment you couldn't provide, when bankruptcy seemed inevitable, and you came to work drunk every day, convinced everything was over, someone saved you. Someone invested $350 million through an anonymous trust with explicit instructions. You never learn who they were. Brandon's attention snapped to Gerald with laser focus, his mind racing through implications he had never considered before. "I know about the investor. That's what saved the company. But what does that have to do with our current situation?" Gerald opened the folder with trembling hands, pulling out documents that looked impossibly official, legally binding agreements, and financial transfers that told a story Brandon had been blind to for nearly 2 decades. "I processed all the paperwork. I signed non-disclosure agreements that would have cost me everything if I violated them. I watched the money come in, and I knew exactly where it came from, but I was legally forbidden from telling you. The investor made it explicitly clear that you were never to know their identity under any circumstances." Brandon's impatience sharpened into something closer to anger, his voice rising with frustration, born from weeks of watching everything collapse. "Then why are you telling me now? Why violate those agreements after all these years?" "Because the trust has been dissolved. The confidentiality agreements included a clause that if the investor ever chose to end the relationship and withdraw all support, I was then obligated to reveal the truth. Those were the terms: silence while the support continued, revelation if it ever stopped." Gerald pushed the documents across the desk, his tears falling onto paper that recorded transactions from 18 years ago, property sales and trust formations and investment transfers that painted a picture Brandon was not prepared to see. The mysterious benefactor who saved your company, who invested $350 million when nobody else would, who believed in your vision when every rational person said you were finished. It was never a mysterious benefactor at all. It was your wife. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, their meaning taking several long seconds to penetrate Brandon's consciousness. When understanding finally arrived, it felt like being struck by something physical and violent, his entire reality reorganizing itself around this new information that made his past look completely different than he had believed. "That's impossible. Tasmin never had that kind of money. She came from nothing. Her family was poor. There's no way she could have invested hundreds of millions." Gerald's voice was gentle but relentless, each word landing like a hammer blow against Brandon's crumbling certainty. "Her mother died 2 years before the crisis, left her a house in a good neighborhood. Tasmin sold that house, her only inheritance, everything she would ever receive from her family. She converted it all into cash and invested every single cent into your failing company through an anonymous trust. She told you it was a mysterious investor because she knew you would never accept help from your wife, that your pride would reject money that made you look weak or dependent." Brandon stared at the documents without seeing them, his mind refusing to process information that rewrote his entire identity. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, every success he had claimed as proof of his genius and vision and determination, all of it existed because his wife had given him $350 million while allowing him to believe he had earned it through his own merit. Why would she do that? Why wouldn't she tell me? Why let me believe I did it alone? Gerald's expression mixed pity with something that looked like barely contained disgust. "Because she loved you. because she believed that building you up was more important than claiming credit for herself. Because she thought protecting your pride mattered more than receiving acknowledgement for her sacrifice. She saved you, Brandon. Everything you have, everything you are, everything you've become, it all exists because your wife gave you her mother's entire legacy and then pretended she had nothing to do with your success. Duh. The office door burst open, and Luna and Harry rushed in, their faces marked with the bruises their father had given them, their eyes red from crying and lack of sleep, and the slow dawning horror of understanding what they had done. They had been standing outside the door, listening, unable to stop themselves from hearing the truth that was destroying their father's world, and would soon destroy what remained of theirs. Luna collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere so deep they felt like they might tear her apart from the inside. We threw her away. We told her she was too old. We said father deserved someone younger. We smiled while he replaced her with that terrible woman. And all along, everything we had, everything we enjoyed, everything we took for granted, it was all because of her. Harry's voice broke around words that felt like they were being ripped out of his chest against his will. She stayed up all night pouring out my alcohol when I was destroying myself. She changed Luna's entire school to save her from bad influences. She woke up before dawn every single day to make sure we had everything we needed, and we repaid her by telling her she was worthless and outdated and embarrassing. We destroyed the best person in our lives because father taught us that love was something you gave conditionally and withdrew when someone stopped serving your purposes. Brandon tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he had not known, but Gerald was not finished delivering truth that had been suppressed for far too long. The investor trust has been dissolved. All remaining funds have been withdrawn. That's why your company is collapsing. The foundation you thought was your own genius was actually your wife's sacrifice, and now that she's gone, now that you drove her away and replaced her with someone who only wanted your money, the entire structure is falling apart because it was never yours to begin with. You didn't build an empire, Brandon. She built it for you, and you were too arrogant and blind to ever acknowledge what she gave you. The three of them sat in that office surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, documents spread across the desk that proved everything they believed about themselves was a lie. Brandon King had not built his success through vision and determination. Luna and Harry had not grown up privileged because their father was brilliant. They had all been living in a house built by a woman they had thrown away, consuming comfort and security and success that came from her sacrifice while treating her like she was worthless and disposable. The company continued its death spiral over the following weeks, creditors seizing assets and investors fleeing and employees abandoning ship before it sank completely. The mansion went into foreclosure, the bank claiming property that was no longer affordable. Possessions were sold at auction to pay debts that kept growing. The King family fortune that had seemed infinite and permanent evaporated like morning fog under harsh sunlight, revealing that it had always been more illusion than substance. Brandon tried desperately to find Tasmin, hiring private investigators who tracked her movements and discovered she had completely rebuilt her life. She had moved to a new apartment, changed her phone number, erased every connection to her old existence. He went to her sister's house, begging for information about where Tasmin had gone and how he could reach her. The door slammed in his face before he finished his first sentence, her sister's fury so pure and justified that he stumbled backward from the force of it. He realized with growing horror that he had lost not just his wife, but his savior, the foundation of everything he had become, the genius who had actually created his success, while he took all the credit and gave her nothing but contempt in return. And there was no way to undo the destruction he had caused. no apology big enough to compensate for the betrayal he had committed, no path back to the woman who had loved him enough to give him everything and ask for nothing in return except basic human decency that he had been too cruel to provide. Chapter 6. The Phoenix Rises from Ashes. Tasmin drove through darkness with no destination, just away from the mansion that had become her prison and the family that had become her executioners. She stopped at a modest hotel near the airport, checking in with cash she had quietly saved over years, emergency funds she hoped never to use, but was wise enough to prepare. The room was small and impersonal, generic furniture and bland paintings, nothing like the mansion she left behind. But when she closed the door and stood in the silence, she felt something she had not experienced in so many years she had almost forgotten the sensation existed. Peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of safety. The knowledge that in this small, anonymous space, nobody would criticize her, or diminish her, or treat her like furniture whose only purpose was function without acknowledgement. She spent the first week simply breathing, allowing her body to remember what rest felt like when you were not constantly preparing for the next crisis or criticism. She ordered room service and ate meals without having to serve anyone else first. She took long showers without worrying about using too much hot water or taking too long when others might need the bathroom. She watched television programs she actually wanted to watch rather than whatever Brandon and the twins had claimed was more important. These small freedoms felt revolutionary after decades of making herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. The grief came in waves that knocked her sideways when she least expected them. She would be brushing her teeth and suddenly remember Luna as a toddler, the way she used to sing made-up songs while Tasmin braided her hair. She would be making coffee and recall Harry at 7 years old, how he used to wake her up on Saturday mornings, demanding pancakes in shapes of animals. These memories hurt worse than the recent cruelty because they proved that love had once been real and uncomplicated before it curdled into something unrecognizable. She cried more during that first week than she had in the previous 20 years combined. Tears she had been holding back finally finding release now that nobody was watching to judge her weakness. But grief, when allowed to run its course without resistance, eventually transforms into something else. The crying jags became shorter and less frequent. The memories stopped ambushing her quite so violently. And underneath the pain, Tasmin discovered something she thought had been killed off through years of systematic diminishment. Anger. Pure, clean, focused rage at what had been done to her and what she had allowed to be done because she believed that good wives accepted whatever treatment their families offered without complaint or resistance. She began remembering who she had been before she became Brandon King's wife, before she sacrificed her ambitions to build his empire, before she convinced herself that love required erasure of self. She had been brilliant once, top of her finance program at Howard University, the kind of student professors fought to mentor, with 3 prestigious firms competing for her attention with 6-figure offers. That genius had not disappeared just because she had been taught to hide it away. It had simply been sleeping, waiting for permission to wake up and reclaim space it should never have surrendered. On her 8th day in that hotel room, Tasmin made a decision that would change everything. She opened her laptop and searched for Sterling Ashford, the man who had loved her before Brandon, the one who proposed on graduation day with a ring bought using money from 3 jobs and eyes full of devotion that had seemed sweet but insufficient compared to Brandon's intense passion. She had rejected Sterling gently but firmly, telling him her heart belonged to someone else. Watching his face crumple with pain, he tried unsuccessfully to hide. He had held her hand one last time and said words she had dismissed as romantic exaggeration from a boy who would surely move on and forget her. "I'll wait forever if you ever need me. Not because I'm pathetic, but because some people only come around once in a lifetime, and I'm smart enough to recognize when I've met mine." She found him easily through professional networking sites, Sterling Ashford was now a successful venture capitalist, his profile showing a distinguished man with kind eyes and a smile that suggested life had treated him well despite early heartbreak. She stared at his photo for 15 minutes, her finger hovering over the message button, fear and hope warring in her chest. What if he had moved on completely? What if reaching out reminded him of pain he had worked hard to forget? What if he rejected her the way she had once rejected him, karmic justice delivered with interest after decades of compounding? But something in his profile photo, a warmth in his expression that suggested he was still the decent man she had once known, gave her courage to type the message that would either reconnect her to possibility or confirm that some doors close permanently when you walk away from them. She kept it simple and honest, explaining that she had left her marriage and was rebuilding her life, that she did not expect anything from him but would appreciate guidance from someone who remembered who she used to be before she forgot herself. Sterling responded within an hour, his words carrying warmth that made her eyes sting with tears that were relief rather than grief. "I remember exactly who you were. Brilliant and kind and capable of absolutely anything you set your mind to. That person didn't disappear just because someone convinced you to hide her. Tell me how I can help bring her back." They met for coffee 3 days later at a quiet place in a neighborhood that felt worlds away from her previous life. Sterling looked exactly like his photo suggested, aged well with dignity, his face carrying lines that came from laughter rather than bitterness. When he saw her walk through the door, his expression transformed into something that made Tasmin's breath catch in her chest. Not pity, which she had been dreading, but recognition and respect, and something that looked dangerously close to the love he had offered decades ago and never quite managed to withdraw, despite her rejection. He stood when she reached his table, and before either of them could speak, he pulled her into a hug that communicated everything words would have failed to express. Safety and welcome, and the promise that she would not have to explain or justify or apologize for taking so long to realize what he had known all those years ago. When they finally sat down, coffee cooling between them while they talked for 3 hours straight, Sterling asked no invasive questions about her marriage or what had driven her to finally leave. He simply listened when she chose to share, and when she finished explaining the basics without going into details that still hurt too much to examine closely, he reached across the table and took her hand. "You always deserved better than whatever brought you here. Now let's figure out how to build the life you should have had all along." Sterling introduced her to his network with the casual ease of someone who understood that connections were currency in professional worlds and was generous enough to share his wealth freely. He arranged meetings with people who ran investment firms and consulting agencies, friends who owed him favors and were willing to take a chance on a woman with a gap in her employment history if Sterling vouched for her potential. He helped her update her credentials and polish her resume, and remember that she had expertise that was valuable, independent of any relationship to Brandon King. Within 2 weeks, Tasmin had 3 serious job offers from firms that saw past her missing years to the brilliance she had never lost. She accepted a position as financial consultant at a prestigious firm that specialized in saving failing companies. The irony not lost on her that she would now be paid substantial money to do professionally what she had done for free in her marriage. Her new colleagues were initially skeptical of the middle-aged woman with the mysterious gap, but skepticism evaporated the first time she presented analysis that identified problems everyone else had missed and solutions that seemed obvious only after she explained them. Her mind, so long forced to operate in shadows, reveled in the freedom to work at full capacity without hiding or minimizing or pretending to be less capable than she actually was. She analyzed market trends and financial statements with precision that bordered on supernatural, seeing patterns that others needed software to detect. She saved her first failing client within 6 weeks, turning their projected bankruptcy into projected profitability, With strategies so elegant, her colleagues studied them, trying to understand how she had made something so complex look so simple. Word spread quickly in the tight professional community. The woman at Sterling's firm who could perform miracles with numbers. The consultant who saw solutions invisible to everyone else. Within 3 months, Tasmin became one of the firm's most requested consultants, her calendar filling with appointments from companies willing to pay premium rates for her expertise. Her income grew rapidly, her bank account swelling with compensation that reflected her actual value rather than being taken for granted as free labor. For the first time in her adult life, she had financial security that belonged to her alone. Money she controlled without needing anyone's permission to spend. Sterling courted her with patience that felt revolutionary after years of being taken for granted. He took her to elegant restaurants where staff treated her as valued guest rather than invisible wife. He invited her to gallery openings and cultural events where people engaged her in actual conversation rather than polite small talk with someone's +1. He bought her beautiful clothes not to change her, but to honor her, to show the world the queen she had always been, but had been taught to hide. He introduced her to his adult children, who welcomed her warmly because they saw how happy she made their father, and because they had learned through their own parents' divorce that second chances at love deserved celebration rather than suspicion. Tasmin reconnected with college, friends she had lost touch with over the years, women who had gone on to become executives and judges and professors, brilliant women who remembered her potential and welcomed her back into their circle with genuine joy. They shared stories over wine and laughter, creating sisterhood based on mutual respect rather than competition for male approval. These women reminded Tasmin that she had once been part of something bigger than one man's empire, part of a community of ambitious, intelligent women who believed they could change the world if given the chance. She started painting again, a passion she had abandoned because Brandon called it frivolous waste of time, better spent on useful activities. Her hands remembered how to create beauty, her eye for color and composition sharpened by years of forced dormancy. A small gallery agreed to display her work after seeing 3 pieces she had completed, and the opening reception attracted genuine interest from collectors who saw talent rather than hobby. She sold every painting that first night. The money less important than validation, that she could create something valuable that existed completely independent of anyone else's approval or permission. Chapter 7. The Queen Claims Her Throne. The promotion came exactly 6 months after Tasmin joined the consulting firm, recognition that her value far exceeded her original position. They made her senior partner with equity stake and decision-making authority and her name on the letterhead. She accepted with grace that concealed how revolutionary it felt to have her contributions acknowledged rather than consumed invisibly, to be valued as essential rather than replaceable, to finally receive credit for genius she had been convinced to hide for decades. Her professional success attracted attention from business publications interested in stories about women who rebuilt themselves after personal catastrophe. She gave several carefully crafted interviews where she spoke about leaving a marriage that no longer served her, about rediscovering professional passion after years away from her field, about the importance of women maintaining their own identities separate from relationships that can end without warning. She never mentioned Brandon by name, never revealed the specific details of her betrayal, never gave satisfaction of public exposure to a man who probably would have welcomed any attention, even negative. She simply told her truth about transformation and resilience. And women across the country wrote to her saying they recognized themselves in her story and were finding courage to save themselves because she had shown it was possible. The letters she received were overwhelming in their emotional intensity. Women trapped in marriages where they had been diminished, wrote thanking her for proving that starting over was possible even when you thought you had waited too long. Women who had abandoned their own careers wrote asking for advice about re-entering professional worlds after decades away. Women who were just beginning to realize they deserved better wrote seeking permission to choose themselves over partners who had convinced them that self-sacrifice was love rather than slow suicide. Jasmine read every letter and responded to as many as she possibly could, creating an informal network of women, supporting women through the terrifying process of reclaiming lives they had given away piece by piece until almost nothing remained. From these letters and conversations emerged the idea for a book, a project Jasmine had not planned but discovered she desperately needed to create. She began writing during evenings and weekends, pouring onto pages all the practical knowledge she wished someone had given her decades ago. The book covered everything, from hiding money to building credit, to understanding divorce law, to creating budgets for single-income households. But more than practical advice, it offered emotional validation that leaving was not failure, that choosing yourself was not selfish, that survival sometimes required abandoning ship before it pulled you under permanently. The manuscript practically wrote itself once she allowed the words to flow. 2 decades of suppressed knowledge and hard-earned wisdom, finding expression in chapters that combined financial strategy with emotional support. She wrote about the importance of having escape funds, about maintaining credit in your own name, about keeping copies of important documents where controlling partners could not destroy them. She wrote about recognizing patterns of emotional abuse, but understanding that love should not require constant self-sacrifice, about trusting your instincts when they tell you something is fundamentally wrong, even if you cannot articulate exactly what. The manuscript found a publisher almost immediately, a press specializing in books by women for women that recognize the massive market hungry for exactly this kind of honest, practical guidance. The book released quietly with minimal marketing budget, but gained momentum through word of mouth and social media recommendations as women shared it with friends and sisters and daughters who needed permission to save themselves. Within 6 months, it had sold enough copies to hit multiple bestseller lists, the royalties adding substantially to income that had already transformed Jasmine's financial situation from comfortable to genuinely secure. She used that growing wealth to start a foundation, providing microloans and business training to women entrepreneurs, particularly those leaving abusive relationships who needed capital to rebuild. She created programs that recognized traditional lending institutions often failed women, whose credit had been destroyed by partners who used money as control mechanism. Her foundation became known for taking chances on women others had written off, for believing in potential that conventional wisdom said was too risky to support. The first year she funded 30 businesses, watching with pride as women who had been told they were worthless discovered they could create successful enterprises. When given proper resources and support, Sterling proposed on an evening that felt ordinary until suddenly it transformed into something extraordinary. They were walking through a park near her townhouse after dinner at their favorite restaurant, discussing plans for expanding her foundation's reach, when he stopped beneath a tree whose branches created cathedral ceiling of leaves illuminated by streetlights. He took both her hands in his, looking at her with love that had waited patiently for decades without demanding anything in return, and spoke words that made her cry for the first time in months. I loved you when you were someone's wife, trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing everything beautiful about you. I love you even more now that you belong only to yourself, now that I can see the woman you were always meant to become. I'm not asking you to give up your independence or change anything about the life you've built with such courage and determination. I'm just asking for the honor of being the man who stands beside you, who supports your dreams without trying to control them, who never makes you smaller so he can feel bigger. Give me the privilege of being the partner you deserved all along, but were never given until now. tears filled Tasmin's eyes, but they were not tears of pain or grief or the complicated sorrow that had defined so much of her adult life. These were tears of peace, of recognition, of understanding that love was supposed to feel like safety rather than sacrifice. She said yes, not because she needed him to complete her, but because she wanted him to complement her. Not because she could not survive alone, but because surviving together would be infinitely sweeter than anything she could build in isolation. They married in a small, intimate ceremony, attended by people who genuinely cared about them. Sterling's children and her college friends and colleagues who had watched her transformation with admiration that bordered on awe. Her life became something she had never imagined possible during those dark years in the King Mansion. She traveled frequently for speaking engagements at conferences and universities. She expanded her foundation's reach, helping more women every year escape circumstances that had once trapped them. She painted whenever inspiration struck, her gallery shows attracting serious collectors. She published a second book about financial strategies for women entrepreneurs. She mentored young consultants at her firm, teaching them not just technical skills, but the importance of valuing themselves properly and never accepting less than they deserved. Meanwhile, Brandon King's obsession with finding her grew into something that consumed what remained of his shattered existence. The private investigators he could barely afford reported back on her new life with details that should have made him happy if he actually loved her, but instead filled him with jealous rage because he could not tolerate her thriving while he suffered consequences of his own cruelty. They told him about her career success and her relationship with Sterling and her growing public profile. They showed him photographs of her at charity events, looking radiant and confident and happier than she had ever looked during their marriage. Every detail felt like accusation, highlighting everything he had destroyed through arrogance and cruelty, and the casual dismissal of a woman who had sacrificed everything to build his empire. But Tasmin knew nothing of Brandon's surveillance or his growing desperation to find her and beg forgiveness. He had not earned. She had moved forward so completely that he existed only as lesson learned, rather than person she still thought about. She had claimed the life she always deserved, and she would not risk that hard-won peace by allowing toxic people back into her orbit simply because they had finally realized what they lost. Her past was dead and buried, and she intended to keep it that way while she built a future that belonged entirely to her. Chapter 8. The Desperate Pilgrimage. Brandon King stood in what remained of his office, surrounded by liquidation notices and eviction warnings and legal documents outlining complete destruction of everything he had believed was his. The company had declared bankruptcy after creditors seized every asset that could be converted to cash. The mansion had been sold at auction to a young family who would never know the history that occurred within those walls. His bank accounts had been emptied, paying debts that kept multiplying even as he tried desperately to contain them. The fortune he had spent decades accumulating had evaporated as quickly as morning fog under harsh sunlight, leaving him with nothing except crushing awareness that he had destroyed the only person who ever truly loved him. Luna and Harry lived with him now in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that represented catastrophic downgrade from their previous life. The building smelled like old cooking oil and mildew. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing at all hours, and the neighborhood had crime rates that made walking anywhere after dark feel dangerous. They worked regular jobs that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, learning through brutal daily experience what real labor felt like when nobody cared about your comfort or feelings, or whether the work drained you of everything except will to continue existing. Luna waited tables at a 24-hour diner where customers treated her like furniture they could abuse without consequence. She smiled through harassment from men who thought tipping gave them ownership of her attention. She carried heavy trays until her feet swelled and her back ached with pain that never quite disappeared, even during the few hours she managed to sleep. She came home smelling like grease and stale coffee, her uniform stained despite endless washing, her eyes empty of the spark that had once made her believe she was special and destined for better things than this grinding poverty. Harry worked delivery for a company that tracked his every movement through GPS and punished him for slowness that came from never having learned how to be efficient with physical labor. He drove a beat-up van through all weather conditions, hauling packages up flights of stairs in buildings without elevators, racing against timers that seemed designed to guarantee failure regardless of how fast he moved. His hands developed calluses, and his shoulders carried permanent ache from lifting boxes that were always heavier than labels suggested. He fell into bed each night too exhausted to even remove his shoes, his dreams haunted by memories of the comfortable life he had taken for granted and helped destroy through his own cruelty. They saw their mother in every exhausted woman serving food or cleaning offices or performing invisible labor that kept society functioning while receiving no acknowledgement or respect. They understood, finally, far too late, what she had given them. The thousands of hours of work that had seemed effortless because she made it look easy. The sacrifices that went unnoticed because she never demanded recognition or appreciation. The unconditional love they had repaid with contempt and betrayal. The guilt was physical weight pressing down on their chests every waking moment, making breathing difficult, turning every day into a reminder of what they had destroyed. Ivory Sullivan remained in the apartment despite having no reason to stay except nowhere better to go and no resources to get there. The wealth she had married for was gone. The lifestyle she had destroyed a family to claim had evaporated. She was stuck with 3 people who looked at her with hatred that was mutual and undisguised. She made no effort to contribute to bills or housework, spending her days scrolling through social media and mourning the life she had expected but failed to secure. Her beauty was already fading without expensive maintenance. Her charm revealed as performance that required wealth to sustain. Her true nature exposed as shallow and fundamentally empty. Brandon became obsessed with finding Tasmin, convinced that if he could just apologize and explain and beg for forgiveness, she might save him one final time, the way she had saved him so many times before. He hired private investigators he could barely afford, paying them with money that should have gone to rent or food, prioritizing his desperate need for redemption over his children's basic survival. The investigators tracked her movements and reported back with details that made his failure more explicit and painful with each update. They told him she was now senior partner at a prestigious consulting firm, that she had published a best-selling book, that she had started a foundation helping women rebuild their lives, that she was in a serious relationship with a man who treated her like she mattered. They showed him photographs of her at charity events wearing elegant gowns, surrounded by people who looked at her with genuine respect and admiration. In every photo, she looked radiant, confident, happier than she had ever looked during their marriage. The evidence of her transformation was knife-twisting in wounds he had inflicted on himself through his own arrogance and cruelty. The investigators discovered she would be honored at a major charity gala in 3 weeks, receiving recognition for consulting work that had saved a children's hospital from closing. The event would be attended by the city's elite, philanthropists and business leaders, and society figures who moved in circles Brandon had once inhabited but was now permanently excluded from. Brandon decided immediately that he would attend, that he would find a way to talk to her and make her understand how sorry he was and how desperately he needed her forgiveness. He did not consider that she might not want his apology, did not pause to wonder whether forgiveness was something owed to people who hurt you or something freely given only when healing made it possible, did not understand that she had spent months deliberately building a life that excluded him from every aspect of her existence. He simply assumed that his suffering entitled him to her attention, that his newfound understanding of what he had lost gave him right to demand audience with the woman he had spent years systematically destroying. He convinced Luna and Harry to accompany him, the three of them planning the trip with desperation that bordered on delusion. They believed that seeing her would somehow make everything better, that their presence would communicate sincerity words alone could not convey, that she would look at them and remember love that had once been real, even if they had spent years killing it through cruelty and indifference. They did not understand that some betrayals are too profound to forgive, some relationships too damaged to salvage, some bridges too thoroughly burned to ever reconstruct, regardless of how desperately the arsonists want to rebuild what they destroyed. The night of the gala arrived, and Brandon drove his old car to the venue, Luna and Harry silent in the back seat, all three of them wearing the best clothes they still owned, which looked shabby and outdated compared to what they used to take for granted. They had no tickets or invitations, no legitimate reason to attend an exclusive event for wealthy philanthropists and society elite. When they arrived, the contrast between their modest vehicle and the limousines pulling up to the entrance made their fall from grace impossible to ignore. Security stopped them immediately, professional but firm in refusing entry to people who clearly did not belong in this gilded world. Brandon tried explaining that he needed to see his wife, that it was an emergency, that his entire life depended on this conversation. The guards listened with expressions mixing pity and contempt, recognizing him from news reports about his company's spectacular collapse and seeing in his desperation the entitlement of men who believed the world owed them access to spaces and people they no longer had any right to claim. Brandon offered bribes that were refused, amounts that would have been substantial before his bankruptcy, but were insulting now given the wealth surrounding this event. He argued and pleaded, his voice rising to levels that attracted attention from guests arriving in designer clothes and jewelry worth more than he would earn in years. Luna and Harry stood behind their father, watching wealthy people look at them with disgust that made them feel smaller and more pathetic with each passing moment. Understanding they had become the kind of people who begged for scraps from lives they once took for granted. Finally, in desperation, Brandon pressed cash into the hand of a young staff member along with hastily written note. The note said he knew what she had done, that he understood now about the $350 million, that he needed to thank her and apologize and make things right. The staff member took the money and note and disappeared into the gala, leaving Brandon and his children waiting outside like beggars at a feast, watching endless stream of wealthy guests flow past them into a world they used to inhabit but had been permanently expelled from through their own choices. The wait felt endless. Time stretching in that particular way it does, when suspended between hope and inevitable disappointment. They stood there for over an hour, security watching them carefully to ensure they did not try entering without permission. Then the door opened and a staff member approached, and for one brief moment Brandon felt hope bloom in his chest that maybe, possibly, she had agreed to see him. But the staff member's expression was neutral, carefully professional, and his words were simple and devastating. "There's a small private room off the main entrance. You've been granted 5 minutes. Follow me." They were escorted to a side room that was elegantly furnished but clearly designed for having conversations that could not happen in public view. The door closed behind them, and they waited in silence, 30 minutes that felt like hours, hope warring with dread. Then finally the door opened again, and Tasman walked in, and everything Brandon thought he understood about his situation revealed itself as catastrophically incomplete because the woman approaching them looked nothing like the wife he remembered and everything like a queen, surveying subjects who had lost the right to her. Mercy. Chapter 9. The Confrontation Without Mercy. Tasmin stood in the doorway of that small private room, and the three people waiting inside felt the temperature drop 20 degrees from the coldness radiating off her like winter wind. She wore an emerald gown that probably cost more than their monthly rent. Her hair swept up in an elegant style that highlighted bone structure that had always been beautiful, but was now somehow more pronounced, as if leaving them had allowed her true self to emerge from hiding. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, not the modest jewelry Brandon had bought her over the years, but serious pieces that announced wealth and status earned rather than borrowed. Her posture was perfect, her expression calm and controlled, and her eyes, when they landed on her former family, held absolutely nothing that resembled the love or forgiveness or mercy they had come begging to receive. Brandon fell to his knees immediately, a dramatic gesture that would have seemed more sincere if it had not been so obviously calculated. Tears streamed down his face, real tears born from real suffering, but Tasmin looked at them with the same detachment she might show watching actors perform tragedy on a stage. His pain did not move her because she remembered too clearly all the times her pain had failed to move him, all the years she had cried invisible tears that he never bothered to notice or acknowledge. "Tasmin, please. I know what you did. Gerald told me everything. The $350 million, your mother's house, the anonymous trust. I know that everything I built, everything I achieved, everything I became, it was all because of you. I was blind and arrogant and cruel, and I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm so sorry. God, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Please give me another chance to be the husband you deserved. I'll do anything, change everything, become whoever you need me to be." His words tumbled out in desperate rush, apologies and promises and declarations that might have meant something if they had come decades earlier, if they had arrived before he systematically destroyed her through years of casual cruelty and deliberate erasure. But timing matters, and these words were coming far too late, offered only because consequences had finally arrived, rather than because he had experienced genuine moral awakening about how badly he had treated the woman who saved him. Luna and Harry were crying too, sobs that shook their thin bodies, guilt and regret pouring out in waves that would have broken their mother's heart if her heart had not already been broken so many times by these same people that it had finally scarred over into something harder and less permeable. Luna's voice cracked around words that cost her everything to speak. "Mama, we were so wrong. We were cruel and selfish, and we took everything you did for granted. Avery made us her servants after you left, forced us to clean and cook and scrub floors, and we finally understood what real work means. We realized you woke up before dawn every day to make sure we had everything we needed. You protected us and guided us and loved us unconditionally, and we repaid you by telling you you were too old, by saying Father deserved someone younger. We threw you away on your own children's birthday. There's no apology big enough for what we did, but please, please, let us try to make it right. Please be our mother again. We need you." Harry's voice joined his sister's, both of them speaking over each other in their desperation to be heard, to communicate sincerity, to somehow bridge the impossible distance their cruelty had created. "We were horrible to you. We learned it from Father, absorbed his contempt and made it our own. But that's not an excuse. We chose to be cruel. We chose to mock you and dismiss you and treat you like you were worthless. Now we're working minimum wage jobs and living in a terrible apartment, and we finally see what you gave us, what you sacrificed. How much strength it took to do what you did every single day without ever asking for anything in return. Please forgive us. Please give us another chance to be the children you deserved." Tasmin listened to all of this without speaking, her face calm and unreadable, her hands folded in front of her with the composure of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this confrontation. She let them finish. Let them exhaust themselves with apologies and promises and desperate pleas for mercy they had never shown her. When their words finally ran out and only their tears remained, when the silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm, each word carefully chosen, each sentence landing like verdict from which there would be no appeal. I spent 20 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger, sacrificing my dreams so you could chase yours, erasing my ambitions so you could build empires on foundations I laid but never claimed credit for. I accepted crumbs of affection while giving you feast after feast of unconditional love. I woke before dawn and worked past midnight. I protected you from consequences and shielded you from discomfort and gave you every advantage I could create through my own invisible labor. And you repaid me by treating me like furniture, like hired help, like an embarrassment you were obligated to tolerate until you found someone better. Brandon tried to interrupt, to explain, to defend himself, but Tasmin raised her hand and he fell silent immediately. Some part of him still recognizing authority when he encountered it, even if he had spent years pretending she had none. I left not because I stopped loving you, but because I finally started loving myself. Because I realized that your happiness was built on my misery, and that is not love, that is exploitation. That is abuse dressed up in the language of family obligation. You did not love me, Brandon. You loved what I did for you, what I gave you. How I made your life easier without demanding anything in return except basic human decency that you were too selfish to provide. She turned to her children, and the pain in her eyes was evident even through the controlled calm of her expression. You chose to follow your father's cruelty instead of my kindness. You had examples of both, and you deliberately selected contempt over compassion. That makes you responsible for your own choices, regardless of who influenced you. Children do not owe their parents blind loyalty, but parents owe their children better examples than the ones your father provided. I tried to give you that. I tried to show you that love means sacrifice, and that family means loyalty, and that people deserve respect, regardless of how much money they have or how fashionably they dress. You rejected those lessons because they were inconvenient. Because being kind required more effort than being cruel. She paused, letting her words sink in, watching them absorb truth they had been running from for months. The money I invested was not a loan to be repaid. It was a gift given by a woman who believed in forever. When you broke that forever, when you replaced me with someone younger and called me too old in front of everyone I had invited to celebrate the children I gave birth to, you forfeited any claim to my labor, my genius, my sacrifice. You do not get to consume my best years and then come begging for more when consequences finally arrive. You do not get to treat me like garbage and then demand I forgive you because you have finally discovered what everyone else already knew. That I was the best thing that ever happened to you, and you were too blind to recognize it until I was gone. Luna rushed forward, grabbing her mother's arm with desperate strength, pleading with eyes that once looked at Tasmin like she hung the moon, but now just looked broken and lost. Is there anything we can do to prove we've changed? Any way to earn back even a fraction of your presence in our lives? Please, Mama, we'll do anything. Tasmin gently removed her daughter's hand from her arm, the gesture tender despite the finality it communicated, and looked into Luna's eyes with sadness that spoke of love that still existed somewhere, but could no longer be accessed through any door they had the keys to open. Change is proven through consistent action over time, not through desperate promises made in crisis. You want forgiveness because you're suffering, and you think I can save you from consequences of your own choices. But I will not be your rescue when you need me while remaining your burden when you don't. I will not sacrifice my newfound peace to fix problems you created through your own selfishness. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the full weight of losing you, because only then will they understand what they had and what they destroyed. Brandon made one final attempt, his voice breaking around words that felt like they were being torn from his chest. I'll do anything, change everything, become whoever you need me to be. Work my entire life to make this right. Please, Tasmin, please don't give up on us. Don't throw away 20 years of history because of mistakes I'm willing to spend the rest of my life correcting. Tasmin turned to face him fully, And what she said next would haunt all three of them for the rest of their lives. Words that communicated finality more effectively than any legal document could. I spent 2 decades being whoever you needed me to be, erasing myself piece by piece until nothing remained except service and sacrifice. I made myself smaller and quieter and more invisible every year because you taught me that love required self-annihilation. I will never again diminish myself for people who could not see my value when I was giving them everything. You did not love me when you had me. You loved what I did for you. Now you can live with the consequences of not appreciating the difference until it was too late. She walked toward the door, her head held high, her steps measured and deliberate. Brandon shouted after her one last time, words that sounded like begging and looked like desperation and communicated nothing except what she already knew, that some people only value what they have after they lose it permanently and completely. Please, I'll prove I've changed. Just give me time to show you. Tasmin paused at the door, her back to them, and delivered the final words that would close this chapter of her life permanently and without possibility of reopening. You had decades to prove you valued me, decades to show appreciation, decades to treat me with basic human respect. You chose cruelty instead. Now live with that choice. Now understand what it feels like to lose something precious because you were too arrogant to recognize its value until it was gone forever. She opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, back toward the ballroom where celebration and music and her actual life waited. Behind her in that small room, Brandon, Luna, and Harry collapsed under the weight of understanding that some things, once broken, can never be repaired. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive. Some people walk away and never come back, regardless of how much the ones left behind might wish otherwise. Chapter 10. The night she danced free. Tasmin returned to the grand ballroom, where the charity gala continued without any awareness of the devastation that had just occurred in a small private room off the main entrance. The space was magnificent, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over hundreds of elegantly dressed guests, an orchestra playing music that floated through air thick with perfume and wealth, and the particular energy that comes from people who have enough money to focus on helping others rather than merely surviving themselves. She moved through the crowd with grace that had always been natural to her, but was now freed from the weight of suppression, no longer diminished by the constant need to make herself smaller so others could feel bigger. Sterling found her immediately, his eyes tracking her movements the way they always did. The way someone watches the most valuable thing in their universe, ready to support or defend or simply witness as needed. He took her hand without asking questions about where she had been or what had happened, trusting that she would share what she wanted to share when she was ready. They had built their relationship on a foundation of respect and trust, revolutionary concepts for Tasmin after decades of marriage, where neither had existed except as words without corresponding actions. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, grounding her in the present moment rather than the painful past she had just revisited. "I am," she answered, and meant it completely. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The evening continued with speeches from various philanthropists and organization leaders, praising the work that had been done to save the children's hospital from closing, acknowledging donors whose generosity had made miracles possible. When Tasmin's name was called and she was asked to stand, the applause was thunderous, genuine appreciation from people who understood the value of what she had contributed. She had analyzed the hospital's financial crisis for free, spending weeks identifying waste and creating sustainable budget that allowed them to continue serving children who had nowhere else to go. Her consulting had saved lives in the most literal sense possible, and the gratitude in that room was real and moving, and everything she had never received during years of invisible labor in the King mansion. After the speeches concluded and dinner was served, After the formal program gave way to social mingling and dancing, Sterling led her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where they could speak without shouting over music and conversation. But before they reached that destination, he stopped suddenly, his entire demeanor shifting into something Tasmin had never quite seen before. There was nervousness mixed with determination, vulnerability combined with certainty. And when he took both her hands in his and looked into her eyes, she felt her breath catch in anticipation of something significant. "I had a whole plan for this," he said, his voice carrying emotion that made it slightly unsteady. "I was going to wait until next month, take you somewhere special, make a grand romantic gesture worthy of you. But standing here tonight, watching you claim your place in a world that should have always recognized your worth, I realized I don't want to wait another minute to ask you what I should have asked decades ago when we were young and stupid. And I let you walk away because I thought love meant letting someone choose what made them happy even if it broke my heart." He took a deep breath and then, right there in the middle of the charity gala with hundreds of witnesses around them, Sterling Ashford lowered himself to one knee with grace that belied his age, his hands still holding hers, his eyes never leaving her face as he spoke words that rewrote the ending of her story into something beautiful and unexpected and absolutely perfect. "I loved you when you were someone else's wife, when I could only watch from a distance and wish you were happy even though I knew you were not. I love you even more now that you belong only to yourself, now that I've seen you reclaim everything you gave away, now that I understand just how extraordinary you actually are. Give me the honor of being the man who never hurts you, the partner who values you, the husband who wakes up grateful every single day that you chose him. Marry me, Tasmin, not because you need me, but because we're better together than apart. Not because I complete you, but because I complement you. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that love is supposed to feel like freedom rather than prison." Tears filled Tasmin's eyes, but they were not tears of pain or grief or the complicated emotions that had defined so much of her adult life. These were tears of pure joy, of recognition, of understanding that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along without realizing it existed. Love that elevated rather than diminished. Partnership that respected rather than consumed. A future that belonged to her rather than being borrowed from someone else's dreams. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear despite the tears, her smile radiant enough to light the entire ballroom. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes to everything you are and everything we can build together." Sterling rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with passion tempered by tenderness. And the applause that erupted around them suggested that their private moment had become public spectacle. But neither of them cared, because in that moment nothing existed except each other and the promise they had just made, and the future they would build on foundations of mutual respect and genuine love. The celebration continued around them, but then something shifted in the atmosphere of the ballroom. A ripple of attention moving through the crowd like wind through wheat. People were turning toward the entrance, whispers spreading, security guards looking tense and uncertain. Tasmin turned to see what was causing the disturbance, and her heart sank when she recognized the three figures standing at the doorway, looking lost and desperate and completely out of place. Brandon, Luna and Harry had somehow made it past the outer security, but they were stopped now at the ballroom entrance by guards who recognized that these shabby figures did not belong in this gilded space. Brandon's suit was wrinkled and ill-fitting, his face haggard, his entire posture communicating defeat and desperation. Luna and Harry stood behind him, looking hollow and broken. The privilege and arrogance that had once defined them completely burned away by months of consequences, leaving nothing but regret that came too late to matter. The crowd grew quiet, everyone sensing drama about to unfold, society's endless appetite for spectacle overriding good manners and discretion. Sterling moved slightly in front of Tasmin, protective instinct kicking in, ready to shield her from whatever was about to happen. But Tasmin gently touched his arm, stepping forward rather than back, her voice carrying across the sudden silence with authority that commanded attention and respect. "Let this old man in." The words landed like grenades, their meaning multi-layered and devastating. Brandon had once been powerful and arrogant and important, a man who commanded rooms and made others feel small through the force of his presence. Now he was just an old man, diminished and desperate, begging for mercy from the woman he had thrown away. The security guards looked uncertain, glancing between Tasmin and their supervisor, unclear whether she was granting permission or delivering insult. She clarified with a slight gesture, and they stepped aside, allowing Brandon and the twins to enter the ballroom. Every eye in the room tracked their movement as they walked toward Tasmin, a march of shame witnessed by hundreds of people who would gossip about this moment for months. Brandon tried to speak when he reached her, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound, all his prepared speeches and desperate apologies dying in his throat under the weight of her calm, steady gaze and the hundreds of witnesses surrounding them. He looked at her standing there in her emerald gown, with diamonds at her throat and Sterling's arm around her waist. And he finally understood that she had not just survived his betrayal, but had transcended it completely, building a life so beautiful and successful that his cruelty had been ultimately powerless to destroy her. Tasmin turned to a nearby waiter, her voice perfectly polite, her expression neutral, her words chosen with precision that made them weapons even though they were disguised as kindness. "Please, give him some food. He looks hungry." The crowd gasped, the insult landing with devastating effectiveness because it was delivered without anger or obvious cruelty. She was treating her former husband like a charity case, like someone to be pitied rather than engaged with as equal. She was reducing him to his current state of poverty and desperation, while simultaneously highlighting her own generosity, showing everyone watching that she could be gracious even to people who had tried to destroy her. Then Tasmin turned away from Brandon and his children, dismissing them as if they were no longer worth her attention. And she added one final statement that would be quoted and discussed and remembered long after this evening ended. "Once I fed his soul. Now I'll only feed his hunger." The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, their meaning immediately clear to everyone present. She had once given him everything, love and sacrifice, and the foundation for his success. Now she would give him nothing except the bare minimum of human kindness you might show to any stranger. The emotional connection was severed. The relationship was dead. The chapter was closed with finality that permitted no reopening regardless of how much he might wish otherwise. The crowd's reaction was audible, gasps and whispers, and a few scattered instances of applause from women who recognized justice when they saw it delivered. Sterling took Tasmin's hand and led her toward the dance floor while the orchestra, sensing the moment, began playing a waltz that seemed designed for exactly this scenario. They moved together with grace born from genuine partnership, her head resting against his chest, his arms holding her close without imprisoning her. Two people who had found each other after decades of waiting and would not waste another moment of the time they had left. Behind them at the entrance, Brandon, Luna, and Harry watched through tears that finally communicated understanding rather than manipulation. They watched her dance with a man who clearly cherished her. They watched her laugh with genuine joy. They watched her exist in a life that had no room for them, that functioned perfectly without their presence, that proved definitively that she did not need them even slightly, despite how desperately they had discovered they needed her. Security eventually escorted them out, gently but firmly, back into the night where they belonged, back to the modest apartment and minimum-wage jobs and consequences they had earned through their own cruelty. They stood outside the venue, looking through windows at the celebration continuing without them, at Tasmin dancing and smiling and living, and they finally understood what they had destroyed. Not just a marriage or a family, but the heart of everything they had ever had. The foundation their entire lives had rested on. The woman who had loved them unconditionally until they taught her that unconditional love was weakness to be exploited rather than treasure to be protected. Inside the ballroom, Tasmin danced and felt something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. Complete and total freedom. Freedom from guilt and obligation. Freedom from people who took without giving. Freedom from the need to make herself smaller so others could feel bigger. She had been reborn from the ashes of her old life, and she would spend whatever years remained to her living fully and authentically, surrounded by people who valued her, doing work that mattered, loving and being loved in return by a man who had waited decades for the privilege. The music rose and swelled, and Tasmin King, who had once believed she was nothing without the family who had thrown her away, danced free and proud and untouchable, proof that some women do not need saving because they are perfectly capable of saving themselves.